The data crystal sat in the center of the examination table, no larger than a child's fist. Rena leaned closer, her triple-jointed fingers hovering over the surface without touching. 3 months of failure had taught her caution. 17 linguistic experts from across the galaxy had examined this object, and 17 times they had walked away with nothing but theories that led nowhere. The crystal had arrived on a transport from Survey Team 9, discovered in the debris field of an abandoned station so old that its construction materials predated modern alloy classification. No distre signals. No records of who built it. Just this crystal, sitting in a hermetically sealed container with a label so faded that even quantum restoration could only recover the words, educational materials. Rena straightened and looked across the laboratory where her colleagues worked in silence. The Threll translator had spent 6 weeks analyzing the symbol patterns using harmonic resonance. The Quarren linguist had applied mathematical probability matrices to every possible combination of the 63 distinct characters found within the text. A Vespid scholar had even suggested the writing might be three-dimensional, readable only when the crystal was rotated at specific angles under polarized light. All failures. The door to the laboratory slid open. Rena turned, expecting another delegation from the Galactic Council demanding progress reports. Instead, a human walked in, looking slightly lost and carrying a worn satchel over one shoulder. "Daniel, right?" he said, extending his hand in that peculiar human gesture. "I was told to report here for the translation project." Rena touched his palm briefly, still uncomfortable with the custom. "You were late. The project began 94 days ago." "Yeah, sorry about that. There was a mix-up with the transport schedules from the research colony. I got bumped for a cargo shipment of Toluvian salt." Daniel set his satchel on an empty table. "So, what are we working with?" The Quarren linguist, whose name translated roughly to 7 stones at dawn, looked up from her workstation. Her eye stalks swiveled toward the human with undisguised skepticism. "We are attempting to decode a language that predates all known civilizations. Your species has only been cataloging written languages for approximately 4,000 years. Perhaps you should observe rather than participate." Daniel nodded slowly. "Right. Observation. Got it." He walked to the central table where the crystal rested. "Can I at least look at it?" Rena gestured permission. The human had traveled far to be here, even if his inclusion in the project was clearly an administrative courtesy rather than genuine need. Humans were relative newcomers to the galactic community, their linguistic databases small compared to species that had maintained records for hundreds of thousands of years. Daniel circled the table, bending to examine the crystal from different angles. The symbols glowed faintly under the laboratory lights, arranged in neat columns that covered every facet of the object. Beautiful, Rena thought, but utterly incomprehensible. "Has anyone translated anything yet?" Daniel asked. "No," Rena said. "The writing system does not correspond to any known phonetic structure. It is not pictographic. It is not mathematical. We have analyzed the frequency of symbol repetition, the spacing between character groups, and the chemical composition of the etching process itself. Nothing yields useful data." Daniel reached into his satchel and pulled out a handheld scanner, considerably less sophisticated than the equipment filling the laboratory. He ran it over the crystal's surface. "What about context? Where is this found?" "An abandoned station," the Threll translator said, his voice vibrating through his chest cavity. "Approximately 48,000 light-years from the galactic core. The station had no power, no atmosphere, and no indication of violence or disaster. It appears the inhabitants simply left. And this was the only thing there. The only intact artifact," Rena confirmed. "The rest of the station had degraded beyond analysis." Daniel frowned, still moving his scanner across the crystal. "That seems strange. If you're abandoning a station, why leave behind educational materials, but nothing else?" 7 stones at dawn made a clicking sound that indicated dismissal. Perhaps it was forgotten. Perhaps it held no value to those who departed. Or, Daniel said quietly, perhaps it was left on purpose. The laboratory fell silent. Rena studied the human's face, trying to read the expression there. Humans were still difficult for her to interpret. Their emotional response is subtle compared to species with chromatophore skin or pheromone communication. Explain, Renna said. Daniel set down his scanner. You said the label called this educational materials. What if that's exactly what it is? Not a historical record, or a religious text, or a technical manual. What if it's meant to teach someone? Teach whom? The Thrall translator asked. The species that created this is extinct or vanished. There are no students. Maybe that's the point, Daniel said. He looked around at the assembled scholars. Maybe whoever made this expected someone else to find it. Someone who didn't speak their language. So they made something teachable. Renna considered this. It was an interesting hypothesis, though she was uncertain how it helped their current situation. Even if true, we still cannot read the text. Not yet, Daniel agreed. He pulled a chair over to the table and sat down, ignoring the surprised looks from the other linguists. In most galactic species, sitting during collaborative work was considered disrespectful. Humans, apparently, had different customs. When human children learn to read, Daniel continued, we don't just give them complex books and expect them to figure it out. We start with simple tools. Alphabets, picture books, word association games. If this really is educational material, there should be something simple here. Something designed for a beginner. 7 stones at dawn's eye stalks curved in a gesture of doubt. We have analyzed every symbol. There is nothing simple about this language. Maybe we're looking at the wrong thing, Daniel said. He stood and walked slowly around the crystal again, this time focusing not on the ornate symbols, but on the edges, the corners, the spaces between the text. Renna watched him work, curious despite herself. The human moved differently than her other colleagues, where they approached the crystal with sophisticated instruments and theoretical frameworks. Daniel seemed almost casual, as if he were browsing books in a library rather than examining an ancient artifact. After several minutes, Daniel paused. Hey, what are these marks here? Manufacturing imperfections, the Thrall translator said. We noted them in our initial assessment. They are irrelevant. Daniel bent closer. Are you sure? They look kind of regular, like they're in a pattern. Renna moved to his side. Along the bottom edge of the crystal, barely visible under the primary text, were small scratches. She had seen them before but dismissed them as damage from thousands of years of storage. But now, looking more carefully, she saw what the human meant. The scratches were evenly spaced, too even to be randomware. Request permission to examine the artifact's container, Daniel said, looking at Renna. The thing it was stored in. Do you still have it? Renna felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Yes, it is in the preservation vault. Can I see it? She nodded and led him from the laboratory, aware that every other scholar was watching their departure with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. Let them watch. 3 months of expert analysis had produced nothing. Perhaps the human's inexperience would provide a fresh perspective or perhaps, she thought as they walked through the corridors toward the vault, she was simply desperate enough to grasp at anything. The preservation vault maintained a constant temperature of -40 degrees. Daniel shivered despite the thermal suit Renna had provided, his breath misting in small clouds. The container sat on a metal shelf, surrounded by a faint shimmer of stasis field. May I touch it? Daniel asked. Renna deactivated the field. Carefully. The material is stable but ancient. The container was rectangular, formed from a dark metal that seemed to absorb light. Daniel lifted it gently and carried it to an examination platform. Under the bright work lights, he could see the surface was covered in small inscriptions, most too faded to read, even with enhancement. Your restoration team tried to recover the text. Daniel asked. Yes. Quantum imaging revealed only fragments. The words educational materials and what might be a classification code. Nothing more. Daniel ran his fingers along the container's edges, feeling for seams or hidden compartments. The metal was smooth, almost frictionless. Then he noticed something on the side panel, a small plate that seemed newer than the rest of the container. This piece here, it's different, he said, pointing. Different metal composition, maybe? Renna scanned it with her handheld device. Her face, normally difficult for Daniel to read, showed surprise. You are correct. This appears to be a later edition, added perhaps 10,000 years after the original construction. Can you read it? She adjusted her scanner. Partially. It is written in an ancient trade language, one that fell out of use approximately 40,000 years ago. I can translate perhaps 60%. Her voice took on a formal tone as she read. Contents, instructional crystal, level designation, intermediate proficiency. Daniel straightened. Intermediate. Not advanced. Not expert level. Intermediate. I do not understand the significance, Rena said. It means whoever made this crystal wasn't writing for other experts in their own language. They were writing for students. People who already had some basic knowledge but weren't fluent yet. Rena's crest flattened slightly, a sign of concentration. That supports your earlier hypothesis. But it still does not explain how we access that knowledge. Daniel thought about his own experience learning languages back on Earth. He had struggled through Mandarin in college, frustrated by characters that seemed impossibly complex. His professor had taught him to break everything down into radicals, the basic components that formed more complicated characters. Start simple, she always said. Build from there. When humans teach reading to children, Daniel said, we use helper tools. Pronunciation guides. Picture dictionaries. Glossaries in the back of books. He looked at Rena. If this is really meant to teach someone, there should be helper tools somewhere. We have analyzed the entire crystal, Rena said, but her tone suggested she was less certain than before. What about the container? Was anything else inside? Only padding material to protect the crystal during storage. We preserved samples, but found nothing of interest. Daniel examined the container more closely, tilting it under the light. The container itself might be part of the teaching system. Look, there are these faint grooves on the inside surface. Could those be text? Rena scanned the interior. Possibly. The material is badly degraded. I will need to take this to the main laboratory for proper analysis. They returned through the cold corridors, Daniel's mind working through possibilities. If this was genuinely educational material, the creators would have anticipated someone finding it who knew nothing about their language. They would have built in redundancies, multiple entry points for learning. Back in the laboratory, Seven Stones at Dawn was still at her workstation, but the Threll translator had left. The Vespid scholar hovered near a holographic projection of the crystal's text, manipulating symbols in three-dimensional space. Any progress? Rena asked. The Vespid's wings buzzed negative. The same patterns repeat, but without understanding their meaning, I cannot establish a framework for translation. Rena placed the container on the central table. We may have overlooked something. Daniel suggests the container itself could contain teaching materials. Seven Stones at Dawn approached, eye stalks extending. That would be unusual. Storage containers are typically utilitarian. Unless the container is part of the lesson, Daniel said. He was examining the faded grooves inside the container, trying to find patterns. You know what this reminds me of? Those Russian nesting dolls. Each layer reveals something new. The Vespid Scholars Translator Unit processed this reference. I'm unfamiliar with this concept. Doesn't matter, Daniel said. The point is, maybe we're supposed to examine everything, not just the crystal itself. The container, the padding, even the shelf it was stored on. Everything might be part of a bigger teaching system. Rena activated a deep scan protocol on the container. Holographic layers began appearing above the table, each one representing a different depth of material analysis. The outer surface showed the faded inscriptions they had already documented. The next layer revealed the metal's crystalline structure. The third layer showed something unexpected. There are micro-engravings inside the metal itself, Rena said, her voice sharp with excitement. Too small to see with standard observation. They form a pattern. The hologram magnified the micro-engravings. Tiny symbols appeared, hundreds of them, arranged in neat grids. They looked similar to the symbols on the crystal, but simpler, with fewer decorative elements. Daniel leaned in. Can you overlay these with the crystal's text? The Vespid scholar manipulated the hologram, bringing up a comparison display. The micro-engraved symbols matched some of the simpler components of the crystal's more complex characters. Building blocks, Daniel said quietly. These are the basic pieces. The radicals, whatever you want to call them. This is how you start learning the language. 7 stones at dawn made a thoughtful clicking sound. If correct, this changes our entire approach. We have been attempting to translate complete text without understanding the fundamental components. Exactly, Daniel said. It's like trying to read a book when you don't know the alphabet. Rena was already pulling up new analysis programs. We need to catalog every micro-engraving and determine which combinations create which symbols on the crystal. Over the next several hours, the laboratory transformed into something resembling controlled chaos. The Vespid scholar mapped spatial relationships between symbols. 7 stones at dawn applied probability analysis to determine which basic components appeared most frequently. Rena coordinated the data collection, her movements precise and efficient. Daniel worked at a simpler terminal, manually comparing symbols and looking for patterns the automated systems might miss. It was tedious work, the kind that made his eyes ache after the first hour, but he found a strange satisfaction in it. This was puzzle solving at its most fundamental level. The Threll translator returned to find the laboratory reorganized around the container rather than the crystal. What has happened here? Progress, Rena said without looking up from her display. The human found a teaching key. The Threll's chest cavity thrummed with interest. Show me. As Rena explained their discovery, Daniel noticed something odd. The micro-engravings inside the container weren't distributed evenly. There were clusters, with some areas of the container's interior surface holding more symbols than others. He pulled up a spatial map, highlighting the density variations. Point 1 section, near what would have been the bottom of the container when stored upright, had an unusually high concentration of symbols. Daniel magnified that area. The symbols there formed distinct groups, each group separated by small dividing marks. Hey, he called out. I think these might be organized into lessons or chapters or something. Look at how they're grouped. Rena came to his terminal. Her crest rose, a sign of excitement. You may be correct. If we number these groups sequentially. She began entering commands, assigning numerical values to each cluster of symbols. The 6th group glowed on the display. Group 6, Daniel said. He looked at the crystal, then back at the container. Page 6. The morning briefing in the main conference chamber drew representatives from a dozen species. Rena stood at the podium, trying not to show her exhaustion. She had been awake for 32 hours, working through the breakthrough with Daniel and the team. The council would want results, not excuses about needing sleep. Council leader Vorn gestured for her to begin. His species communicated primarily through color shifts in their skin, but he had learned to use the translation collar for official proceedings. Archivist Rena, your request for additional resources was flagged as urgent. Explain. Rena activated the central hologram display. The crystal materialized above the conference table, rotating slowly. 96 days ago, we received an artifact containing text in an unknown language. As of yesterday morning, we had made 0 progress in translation. Murmurs rippled through the assembled representatives. Born's skin flickered with impatient orange. We are aware of your lack of progress. That is why this meeting was called. As of yesterday evening, Rena continued, we have successfully decoded the writing system and begun translating the content. The murmurs stopped. Every representative leaned forward. Rena changed the holographic display to show the container's micro-engravings. The breakthrough came from examining not just the primary text, but the entire artifact system. The container includes a teaching component with basic linguistic elements. Who made this discovery? Asked a representative from the Quarren homeworld, 7 stones at dawn superior. The human linguist, Daniel Wright. The Quarren representative's eye stalks retracted slightly, a sign of surprise. A human? Their linguistic databases are among the smallest in the galactic community. True, Rena said, but Daniel approached the problem from a different angle. He suggested we were making an error in our fundamental assumptions. She gestured to the back of the chamber, where Daniel sat looking uncomfortable in formal clothes. Would you explain your reasoning? Daniel stood, clearing his throat. Yeah, so everyone was treating this like it was a complete, standalone text, like reading a novel or a legal document. but the label on the container said it was educational material at an intermediate level. He walked to the holographic display. On Earth, when we teach languages, we don't just hand someone a complex book and say figure out. We give them tools, dictionaries, grammar guides, pronunciation keys. I figured if this was really meant to teach people, those tools had to be somewhere, and they were hidden inside the container. Vorn asked. Not hidden, Daniel said, just not where anyone thought to look. Everyone was focused on the crystal because that had the impressive-looking text. The container seemed like just packaging, but it turns out the container is part of the lesson. He manipulated the hologram to show the micro-engravings. These are the basic components of the language, the building blocks. Once we catalog them and figure out how they combine, we could start breaking down the more complex symbols on the crystal. A Vespid representative buzzed a question through her translator. How many symbols have you translated? About 40%, Rena said. Enough to understand the general content and purpose of the text. Which is? Vorn's skin shifted to attentive blue. Rena changed the display again, showing sections of translated text. The crystal contains a historical chronicle. It was created by a species that called themselves the Pren. They were explorers who made contact with hundreds of other species over thousands of years. She highlighted a particular passage. The Pren deliberately designed their language to be teachable. They expected to encounter other species who wouldn't understand them, so they built learning tools into everything they created. Why? Asked the Threll representative. Most species use translation technology for cross-species communication. The text suggests the Pren believed direct language learning created deeper understanding than machine translation, Rena said. They wanted other species to truly comprehend their ideas, not just get rough approximations. Daniel spoke up again. There's something else. The text mentions other teaching crystals. The Pren left them scattered across space, each one containing different knowledge. This one seems to be an introduction to their culture and philosophy. Vorn's skin rippled with interest. Where are these other crystals? The text includes coordinates, Rena said. We have identified 6 potential locations so far, though we have not finished translating the complete list. This is significant, Vorn said. The Council will authorize a full expedition to recover these artifacts. There is one complication, Daniel said. He looked at Rena, who nodded for him to continue. The teaching method is kind of specific. You can't just scan the crystals and dump the data into a computer for instant translation. The Pren designed their system to require active learning. Each crystal builds on the previous one, teaching more complex concepts gradually. That seems inefficient, the Corn representative said. Maybe, Daniel agreed, but it might be intentional. If you want to really understand another culture, you need to put in the work. You need to struggle with their language, figure out how they think, see the world from their perspective. The Pren seemed to have believed that was important. He pulled up another section of translated text. There's this part near the end of the introduction. It says something like, "Those who seek only the destination will miss the journey. Those who rush to answers will not understand the questions. We leave these teachings for those patient enough to learn." The conference chamber was quiet. Rena watched the assembled representatives processing this information. Some seemed intrigued. Others looked skeptical. Finally, Vorn spoke. You mentioned the container held teaching materials organized into groups. How did you know which group to examine first? We didn't initially, Rena said. We began with the first group, assuming a sequential structure. But Daniel noticed something unusual about Group 6 specifically. Daniel nodded. The 6th group had a higher concentration of symbols than the others. And when we analyzed them, they formed what looked like a reference guide. Basic grammar rules, common word structures, pronunciation guides. Everything you'd need to start translating the main text. Why Group 6? The Vespid representative asked. Why not Group 1? That's what I wondered, Daniel said. Then I remembered something from my own language learning. Sometimes textbooks put the most useful information in the middle, after they've introduced basic concepts, but before things get too complicated. It's like a checkpoint, a place where you can pause and make sure you understand the fundamentals. He smiled slightly. When I was stuck on a problem in school, my professor used to say check page 6. It was kind of a joke in our class because page 6 of our textbook had this really helpful summary chart. The idea was if you're lost, go back to the basics. Review the fundamentals before trying to tackle the advanced stuff. And you applied this human educational concept to an alien artifact, Vorn said. Yeah, pretty much. I figured if the Prin really wanted to teach people, they'd include something like that. A reference point. A place to start when everything else seems overwhelming. 7 Stones at Dawn, who had been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke. I must admit, I was skeptical of including humans in this project. Your species' linguistic experience seemed limited compared to others. But you brought a perspective none of us considered. That's the thing about diversity, Daniel said. Different experiences lead to different insights. Humans have thousands of languages on one planet. We're used to the idea that communication is hard, that understanding takes effort. Other species might have it easier with telepathy or universal neural patterns or whatever. But that also means you might not think about learning the way we do. Rena stepped forward. The council should know that continuing this research will require significant time investment. We cannot simply download the Pren knowledge. We must learn it properly, following their teaching methodology. How long? Vorn asked. Months at minimum, possibly years for the more advanced crystals. That is acceptable, Vorn said after a moment's consideration. This discovery is too valuable to rush. Archivist Rena, you will lead the expanded research team. Includes specialists from multiple disciplines, not just linguistics. And Daniel Wright. Rena asked that Vorn's skin shifted to a proving green. The human has proven his value. Make him deputy director of the project. His unconventional thinking may continue to serve us well. Daniel looked surprised. I'm not sure I'm qualified to. You found what 17 experts missed, Vorn interrupted. You are qualified. The question is whether you accept. Daniel looked at Rena, then at the hologram of the crystal still rotating above the conference table. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, I accept. The expedition to the first coordinate location took 37 days of faster-than-light travel. Daniel spent most of that time in the ship's linguistics lab, working with Rena and an expanded team of specialists. They had brought the original crystal and its container, continuing to extract every possible piece of information from both. The Pren language was complex but elegantly structured. Once Daniel and the team understood the basic building blocks from page 6, the rest began falling into place like a vast puzzle. Each symbol they decoded revealed connections to others, creating a web of meaning that grew more intricate the deeper they studied. Listen to this section, 7 Stones at Dawn said one morning, reading from a newly translated passage. The Pren described their first contact with a species called the Vrel. They say, "We found them beautiful in their strangeness, singing songs in frequencies we could not hear, building cities in patterns we could not comprehend. So we learned. We built instruments to hear their songs. We studied mathematics to understand their architecture. And in learning, we were changed." Daniel looked up from his own work. That's pretty philosophical for a historical chronicle. The Pren seem to have valued transformation through understanding, Rena said. Every contact they describe focuses not on what they gain materially, but on how the encounter changed their perspective. The ship's AI announced their arrival at the first coordinate. Daniel followed Rena to the observation deck, where a massive view screen showed the target location, a small moon orbiting a gas giant in an otherwise empty system. The moon's surface was barren, scoured by cosmic radiation over millennia. But sensors detected a structure buried beneath 30 meters of regolith. The expedition team suited up and took a shuttle down, Daniel included despite his lack of formal xenoarchaeology training. You found the first crystal, Rena had said when he questioned his inclusion. You should be here when we find the second. The structure turned out to be a small chamber, perfectly preserved beneath the surface. Inside, mounted on a simple pedestal, sat another crystal. This one was larger than the first, deep blue instead of clear, and covered in symbols that were immediately recognizable as Pren writing. But there was something else. The chamber walls were covered in images. Holographic projections activated as the team entered, showing scenes of the Pren themselves. Daniel stared at the images. The Pren had been bipedal, with 4 arms and luminescent skin that seemed to shift colors. In the projections, they moved among members of dozens of other species, teaching, learning, building together. They documented everything, the Vespid scholar said, her voice awed. These are not just words. They left visual records of their encounters. Rena carefully retrieved the crystal from its pedestal. Unlike the first one, this crystal came with a container that was still intact, its surface covered in the same micro-engravings they had learned to recognize as teaching tools. Back on the ship, the team gathered to examine the new discovery. Daniel opened the container and found something unexpected, a small metallic disc nestled beside the crystal. "What is this?" he asked, holding it up. Rena scanned it. "Some kind of data storage, but the format is ancient. We will need to fabricate special equipment to read it." It took 3 days to build a compatible reader. When they finally accessed the disk, it contained audio recordings. The Pren language spoken aloud, along with what appeared to be pronunciation guides and conversational examples. Daniel listened to the recordings through his translator unit, which struggled to process the unfamiliar sounds. The Pren voice was melodic, with tonal variations that carried meaning beyond the words themselves. "This changes everything," Seven Stones at Dawn said. "We have been learning to read their language, but this allows us to understand how it sounded, how they actually spoke." Over the following weeks, as the ship traveled to the next coordinate, the team worked through the second crystal's content. It built directly on the knowledge from the first, introducing more complex grammatical structures and philosophical concepts. The text described the Pren's core belief that diversity was not just valuable, but essential for wisdom. They had deliberately sought out species as different from themselves as possible, believing that understanding alien perspectives expanded consciousness itself. They were scientists and philosophers combined, Rena said during one of their study sessions. Every encounter was an experiment in empathy. Daniel was reading a section about the Pren approach to conflict resolution when something clicked in his mind. They weren't just exploring space. They were exploring cognition. Different species think differently because they evolved in different environments with different survival pressures. The Pren wanted to collect all those different ways of thinking. To what purpose? The Threll translator asked. Maybe they believed that understanding every possible perspective would let them see the universe as it truly is, Daniel said. Like, each species sees reality through their own filters. But if you could combine all those views, you get something closer to objective truth. The Vespid scholar's wings buzzed thoughtfully. That would require incredible patience. Learning to think like another species is not a quick process. The Pren seem to have had time, Rena noted. The chronicles suggest their civilization lasted at least 50,000 years. Where did they go? Daniel wondered aloud. If they were so advanced, so dedicated to learning and connection, why aren't they still around? That question hung over the team as they recovered 3 more crystals over the next several months. Each crystal built on the previous ones, teaching more advanced concepts while revealing more about Pren history and philosophy. The team grew more proficient at the language, no longer needing to rely so heavily on the teaching tools, though they still consulted page 6 reference materials whenever they encountered particularly complex passages. The 5th crystal contained a revelation that shook everyone. Daniel was the first to translate the relevant section, working late in the linguistics lab while the rest of the team slept. Rena, he called over the comm system, not caring that it was the middle of the ship's night cycle. Rena, you need to see this. She arrived 10 minutes later, her crest disheveled from sleep. What is it? Daniel pointed to his display. The Pren didn't die out. They didn't get destroyed by war or plague or natural disaster. They chose to leave. Leave? Leave where? I'm not sure yet. The text is kind of vague, but it says they reached a point where they felt they had learned everything they could in this form. So he struggled to translate the concept. Transcended? Transformed? Moved beyond physical existence somehow. Rena read the passage herself, her expression unreadable. This seems like mythology, not history. Maybe, but the Pren were pretty literal in everything else they wrote. Why would they suddenly start speaking in metaphors? They called the rest of the team. For hours, they debated the meaning of the text. Some argued it was allegorical, describing cultural evolution rather than literal transformation. Others thought it might describe some kind of technology that allowed the Pren to exist in a non-physical state. 7 Stones at Dawn offered a different interpretation. Perhaps they recognized that their physical forms were limiting. They had learned to think like hundreds of other species, but they were still confined to their own biological constraints. So they found a way to exist as pure information, pure thought, like uploading themselves into a computer. Daniel asked, "More complex than that, I think. The text mentions becoming part of a universe itself. Dispersed consciousness, maybe, existing everywhere and nowhere simultaneously." The Thrall translator rumbled skeptically. "That sounds like fantasy. So would faster-than-light travel to a species that hadn't discovered it yet," Daniel pointed out. "Just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it's impossible." Rena looked at the crystal, its blue surface glowing softly in the lab lights. If true, it explains why they left these teaching crystals behind. They wanted other species to follow their path, to learn, to grow, to eventually transcend as well. "That's a hell of an invitation," Daniel said quietly. The sixth crystal, when they finally recovered it from a hollow asteroid drifting in interstellar space, confirmed their theories. It contained not just historical records, but instructions. A guide to what the Pren called the Great Work. The Great Work was not a single project or goal. It was a philosophy, a methodology, a way of approaching existence itself. Daniel sat in the linguistics lab, reading through the translated instructions for the third time, trying to fully grasp what the Pren were proposing. "Start with humility," the text began. "Recognize that your perspective is limited by your biology, your culture, your history. You see reality through filters you did not choose and cannot fully remove, but you can acknowledge them." The next section described a process of systematic learning. The Pren advocated studying other species, not just superficially, but deeply, learning their languages without relying on translation technology, understanding their art, their mathematics, their philosophies, attempting to genuinely think the way they thought. "It is not enough to know facts about others," the text said. "You must experience their worldview. When you can solve a problem the way a Vrel engineer would solve it, or compose music that would move a Threll heart, or navigate social situations with core and grace, then you begin to understand." Daniel found this simultaneously inspiring and exhausting. The Pren were describing a lifetime of work. Multiple lifetimes, really. No single being could master the perspectives of hundreds of species, unless that was the point that he kept reading. The later sections of the crystal described what the Pren called the convergence. After mastering enough different perspectives, something shifted in their consciousness. The boundaries between self and other became less rigid. They began to experience reality in more dimensions, to perceive patterns that were invisible to single perspective thinking. "We found that truth is not singular," the text explained. "What appears contradictory from one perspective harmonizes from another. The universe is larger and stranger than any one species can comprehend. But together, combining all our different ways of seeing, we approach something closer to complete understanding." The final sections became harder to translate. The Pren were describing experiences that didn't map easily onto any known language. Daniel did his best, working with Rena and the team to find approximations. They talk about dissolving individual consciousness into something collective, 7 Stones at Dawn said, reading one particularly difficult passage. But not like a hive mind, more like individual notes combining into a symphony while still remaining distinct. And they claim this state allows perception beyond physical limitations, the Vespid scholar added. Awareness of quantum probability, experience of multiple time streams simultaneously, access to information that exists outside conventional space-time. The Threll translator shook his head, crest bristling. This is mysticism dressed in scientific language. They are describing what they wanted to believe, not what they actually achieved. "Maybe," Daniel said, But they left these crystals in very specific locations. 6 different sites, all chosen for particular properties. And they included coordinates for a 7th site that they call the repository. He brought up a star map showing all the crystal locations. The 6 they had visited formed a pattern, a geometric shape that enclosed a volume of space approximately 200 light-years across. At the center of that shape sat the 7th coordinate. If we're following their teaching method correctly, Daniel continued, we're supposed to visit each site in order, learning progressively more complex concepts. And the final site should contain. He trailed off, uncertain how to finish. Should contain what? Rena asked. I think it contains proof. Whatever the Pren achieved, whatever they became, they left evidence of it at the repository. The council authorized the expedition to the 7th coordinate, though with considerable debate. Some council members argued they should focus on practical applications of Pren technology rather than chasing philosophical mysteries. Others worried that the Pren might have made dangerous discoveries that led to their disappearance. We are talking about a civilization that deliberately erased itself, one representative argued during the authorization hearing. Perhaps we should view this as a warning, not an invitation. But Daniel stood before the council and made a case that surprised even himself. The Pren didn't erase themselves. They transformed. And yeah, that's scary. Fundamental change always is. But they left these teaching crystals because they wanted other species to have the same opportunity. They believed understanding was valuable enough to preserve, even after they themselves moved beyond needing it. He pulled up images from the crystal chambers, showing the Pren working alongside dozens of other species. Look at these records. These people spent thousands of years learning from others, teaching others, building bridges across every kind of difference imaginable. And they did it the hard way. No forced telepathic linking. No algorithmic translation. Just patient, deliberate effort to genuinely understand perspectives different from their own. Our galaxy has thousands of species, and most of us barely understand each other. We trade, sure. We negotiate treaties. We share technology. But do we really comprehend how other species think? Do we know why a Vespid makes the choices she makes? Or what drives a Korn's moral reasoning? Or what it feels like to be a Threll? The Pren believed that kind of understanding was possible. More than possible, necessary. They thought diversity wasn't just some nice ideal, but the actual mechanism by which consciousness evolves. And they left us a roadmap showing how they did it. The silence in the council chamber was profound. Finally, Vorn spoke, his skin shifting through several colors before settling on contemplative purple. The human makes a compelling argument. We authorize the expedition to the repository, but we do so with the understanding that this is research, not conversion. We seek knowledge, not transformation. With respect, Daniel said, I don't think you can separate those things. Real knowledge changes you. The Pren knew that. It's why they designed their teaching method to require effort. If you genuinely learn to see the world through another being's eyes, you can't go back to seeing it only through your own. The journey to the repository took 42 days. Daniel spent most of that time reviewing everything they had learned, preparing himself for whatever waited at the final coordinate. The other crystals have been found in remote locations, deliberately isolated. But the repository was different. That IT sat in a stable orbit around a binary star system, a massive structure visible from millions of kilometers away. As their ship approached, sensors revealed it to be artificial, built from materials that predated anything in the galactic databases. The structure was beautiful. Crystalline towers spiraled outward from a central sphere, each tower glowing with its own internal light. As the ship drew closer, those lights began to pulse in patterns that seemed almost like communication. Are we receiving any transmissions? Rena asked the ship's communication officer. No conventional signals, the officer replied. But there is some kind of energy fluctuation synchronized with the light patterns. It is not registering on any known spectrum. Daniel stared at the view screen, watching the lights pulse. Something about the pattern seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Then it hit him. It's language, he said. The light patterns. They matched the structure of Pren-written symbols. The Vespid scholar buzzed excitedly. He's right. Look at the sequence. It corresponds to the introductory phrase from the first crystal. They're greeting us, 7 stones at dawn, said softly. The ship received permission to dock at a port that opened in the structure's central sphere. A team of 12, including Daniel, suited up and entered the repository. Inside, they found a chamber larger than any building Daniel had ever seen. The walls curved upward and inward, forming a perfect sphere. And covering every centimeter of those walls were symbols. Millions of them, billions maybe, all glowing with soft light. This is not just a library, Rena whispered. This is a mind. At the center of the chamber floated a single crystal, larger than all the others combined. As the team approached, it began to glow brighter, and a voice filled the chamber. Not sound, exactly. More like meaning transmitted directly into their consciousness, bypassing language entirely. But it felt like hearing words. Welcome, seekers, the voice said. We are pleased that someone finally completed the journey. Daniel had expected many things when they reached the repository. Ancient computers, preserved Pren bodies, maybe even some kind of stasis chamber where the Pren waited unchanged by time. But this, a consciousness without form, speaking without words, was beyond anything he had imagined. Are you the Pren? Rena asked, her voice barely above a whisper in the vast chamber. We are what the Pren became, the presence replied. Individual and collective. Many in one. The paradox that is no longer paradoxical when you perceive enough dimensions. Daniel felt his translator unit struggling to process the concepts being transmitted. The presence seemed to notice his difficulty and adjusted somehow, making the communication simpler, more linear. Apologies, it said. We have been alone for so long. We forgot how to think in straight lines. Your presence reminds us of when we were discrete beings, bound by sequential time. You left the crystals, 7 stones at dawn said. The teaching system. Why? Because we remember being where you are. Sensing that consciousness could expand beyond our limitations, but not knowing how. We wanted to leave a path for others to follow if they chose. The giant crystal pulsed with light, and suddenly the chamber walls came alive with images. Not holographic projections, but something more immediate, more real. Daniel saw the Pren, as they had been thousands of years ago, walking among members of other species, learning, teaching, growing. We spent millennia in the great work, the presence explained. Each encounter with another species gave us new eyes. The Vrel taught us to perceive electromagnetic fields as art. The Corn showed us how probability could be sculpted like clay. The Threll gave us understanding of harmonic reasoning, where truth emerges from the relationship between vibrations. The images shifted, showing Pren scholars studying with members of hundreds of different species. Not just observing, but participating fully in their lives, their cultures, their ways of thinking. We learned that consciousness is not a single thing, but a spectrum. The presence continued. Each species occupies a different position on that spectrum, shaped by their evolution, their environment, their history. And each position reveals aspects of reality that are invisible from other positions. Daniel watched a Pren working alongside a crystalline being whose species he didn't recognize. They were solving a mathematical problem, but the Pren was using the crystalline being's method, not translating it into Pren mathematics, but genuinely thinking in that alien framework. That is the key, the presence said, seeming to sense Daniel's attention on that particular image. Not translation, but transformation. When you truly learn another being's language, their art, their logic, you add their perspective to your own. You become more than you were. And when you had collected enough perspectives, Rena asked, the images showed Pren gathering in massive assemblies, thousands of them moving in synchronized patterns. We reached a threshold. When enough different ways of seeing combined in single minds, our consciousness began to expand. We could perceive things that had always been there, but were invisible to single perspective awareness. Quantum states before collapse. Probability clouds as tangible objects. The shape of space-time itself. not as abstract mathematics, but as direct experience. And we realized that individuality, as we had known it, was just one way of being conscious. There were others. The chamber filled with light that seemed to have dimension and texture. Daniel felt something brush against his mind, not invasive but gentle, like a question being asked without words. He instinctively opened himself to it and suddenly experienced a fragment of what the presence was trying to describe. For one disorienting moment, he was aware of himself from outside himself. He could feel Rena's curiosity, Seven Stones at Dawn's analytical processing, the Vespid scholar's multifaceted perception. Not thoughts exactly, but the quality of how they thought. And in experiencing all those perspectives simultaneously, he glimpsed patterns he had never noticed before. Then the sensation faded, leaving him gasping. That was overwhelming, he managed. That was a fraction of what we experience, the presence said gently. We do not expect you to follow our path immediately. The transformation took us thousands of years. We left the teaching crystals so others could begin the journey at their own pace. The Thrall translator, who had been silent until now, spoke up. But you want us to become like you, to abandon individual existence. No, the presence said firmly. We want you to have the choice we had. Individual existence is valuable. We remember it fondly. But it is not the only option. When you have mastered enough perspectives, when your consciousness has expanded sufficiently, you may discover other ways of being, or you may choose to remain as you are. Both paths have worth. The giant crystal pulsed again, and new images appeared. These showed repositories like the current ones scattered across the galaxy, each one a node in some vast network. We left these teaching systems in multiple locations, the presence explained. Each civilization that finds them can learn at their own pace, in their own way. Some may choose to follow the great work fully. Others may take only what they need for their current challenges. We do not judge either choice. What happens if we complete the great work? Daniel asked. If we follow your path all the way, you would join us, the presence said simply. Not as servants or copies, but as new voices in the chorus. Each species that achieves transformation brings unique perspectives we have never experienced. You would change us even as we change you. Rena stepped closer to the central crystal. Show us. Show us what you have become. The chamber's lights intensified. Daniel felt the presence extending itself, allowing them to perceive just the barest edge of its true nature. He saw consciousness distributed across light years, individual Pren minds that had merged while remaining somehow distinct. He glimpsed awareness operating in dimensions he couldn't name, perceiving realities that had no words. And he understood, in a flash of insight, why the Pren had designed their teaching method the way they had. Why they required slow, patient learning instead of quick downloads. Why they insisted on genuine understanding rather than superficial knowledge. Because transformation of this magnitude couldn't be forced or rushed. It required fundamental changes in how consciousness operated, changes that could only come through deliberate, sustained effort. You had to build new neural pathways, new ways of processing information, new frameworks for understanding. And that took time. The vision faded. Daniel found himself back in the chamber, his colleagues around him looking equally shaken. We will need to discuss this, Rena said carefully. The council will need to decide how to proceed. Of course, the presence agreed. We have waited 50,000 years. We can wait longer. The repository will remain here, open to all who seek it. The teaching crystals will continue to offer their lessons. When you are ready to learn more, we will be here. And if we decide not to pursue the great work, Seven Stones at Dawn asked, if we choose to remain as we are, then we will respect that choice, the presence said. The Pren learned from hundreds of species, but we never forced our path on any of them. We believe in the value of diversity, remember? A galaxy where every species followed the same path would be poorer for it. The team spent 3 more days at the repository, documenting what they could and asking questions. The presence answered patiently, though some concepts remained beyond translation into any known language on the final day. As they prepared to return to their ship, Daniel lingered in the central chamber. The presence seemed to sense his hesitation. "You have a question," it said. "Yeah," Daniel admitted. "Why us? Why now? The galaxy has been exploring space for millions of years. Why are we the first to find your teaching crystals?" The presence was silent for a moment. When it spoke again, Daniel sensed something like sadness in the communication. "You're not the first. 6 other species found our teaching systems over the millennia. 3 abandoned the lessons because they seemed too difficult. 2 tried to force the process, to accelerate beyond what their minds could handle, and destroyed themselves. 1 completed the early stages but then chose to remain individual, and we lost contact with them thousands of years ago. You are the 7th species to find us, and the first to approach the teachings the way we intended, with patience, with humility, with genuine desire to understand rather than simply to acquire power." Daniel thought about that. It was almost an accident, though. If I hadn't suggested looking at page 6, we might have given up too. "There are no accidents," the presence said, and Daniel couldn't tell if it was being profound or playful. "You found the teaching key because you were looking for it in the right way. Because your species has experience with language barriers, with the difficulty of genuine understanding. Because you value the journey as much as the destination." "Not all humans think that way," Daniel said honestly. "No," the presence agreed. "But enough do. Enough to make us hopeful that your species might complete what others began and abandoned." Back on the ship, the team gathered for one final meeting before beginning the journey home. Rena stood at the head of the conference table, looking at the assembled scientists and scholars. "The council will want recommendations," she said. "What do we tell them?" The discussion lasted hours. Some argued for full commitment to the great work, believing the potential benefits outweighed any risks. Others urged caution, suggesting they should study the teaching crystals carefully before making any civilization-wide decisions. Daniel listened to all sides before offering his own thoughts. "I think we present it exactly as the print intended. As an option, not an obligation. Make the teaching materials available to anyone who wants to learn. But don't force it on anyone, and don't promise guaranteed results. Some species will pursue the great work seriously. Others will just take what they find useful for current problems and ignore the rest. And that's okay. The Pren spent 50,000 years on this. We shouldn't expect to decide our entire approach in a few months." 7 Stones at Dawn clicked thoughtfully. "The human suggests we treat this as an ongoing educational resource rather than a crisis requiring immediate response." "Exactly," Daniel said. "Set up study groups. Offer courses in Pren language and philosophy. Let people engage at whatever level feels right to them. And maybe, over time, enough individuals will master the early teachings that will be ready to make a collective decision about going further." Rena looked around the table. "Are we in agreement?" One by one, the team members indicated their support. Even the skeptical Threll translator nodded, though he added, "I still believe we should focus primarily on practical applications. But I acknowledge the value in preserving the option for deeper study." The report to the Galactic Council took 3 weeks to compile. It included full translations of all 6 crystals, detailed documentation of the repository, and careful recommendations for how to proceed. When Rena finally stood before the council to deliver their findings, Daniel sat in the gallery watching. She explained everything they had learned, holding nothing back. The great work, the transformation, the presence that claimed to be what the Pren had become. The council listened in stunned silence. When she finished, Vorn's skin shifted through a dozen colors before settling on contemplative purple. "This is perhaps the most significant discovery in galactic history," he said finally. "And the most disturbing. You are asking us to accept that consciousness can exist in forms we do not understand, that transformation is possible beyond anything we have imagined." "I'm asking you to keep an open mind," Rena replied. "The Pren left us a gift. Whether we choose to accept it fully or only use parts of it, that is for each species, each individual to decide. But we should not reject it out of fear." The council debated for 2 days before reaching a decision. They would establish the Pren Cultural Exchange Initiative, a voluntary program for studying the teaching crystals and Pren philosophy. Resources would be allocated for research and education, but participation would remain entirely optional. Daniel was appointed director of the new initiative. When Vorn informed him of this decision, the council leader's skin showed genuine respect. "You found a key that unlocked an ancient mystery," Vorn said. "You showed us the value of simple approaches to complex problems. And perhaps most importantly, you reminded us that understanding takes patience." "I just looked at page 6, Daniel said with a slight smile. "Yes," Vorn agreed. "Sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most basic principles. Start with the fundamentals. Value the teaching tools. Never rush past the simple lessons in pursuit of advanced knowledge." 6 months later, the Prin Cultural Exchange Initiative had attracted students from 43 different species. Daniel stood in the new teaching facility, watching a Vespid scholar working through basic Prin grammar exercises while a young Quarren practiced pronunciation using the audio recordings. Rena joined him at the observation window. "We received word from the repository today. The presence says it can sense our progress. It is pleased. How can it sense us from halfway across the galaxy?" Daniel asked. "I have stopped trying to understand all the implications of what the Pren became," Rena admitted. "For now, I focus on what I can grasp. The language, the philosophy, the teaching method, the fundamentals," Daniel said. "Exactly." She paused, watching the students work. "Do you think any of our species will complete the great work? Will anyone transform the way the Pren did?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I honestly don't know. Maybe not in my lifetime. Maybe not for thousands of years. But we're taking the first steps. We're learning to genuinely understand perspectives different from our own. And that alone seems valuable, regardless of where it ultimately leads." "Page 6 thinking," Rena said with what might have been amusement. "Page 6 thinking," Daniel agreed. "Start with the basics. Build from there. Trust the process." In the teaching facility below, a human student was helping a Threll understand a particularly difficult concept, explaining it using an analogy drawn from Threll musical theory. The Threll's crest rose in sudden comprehension, and both beings shared a moment of genuine connection across the gap between their species. Daniel smiled. It was a small moment, almost insignificant in the vast sweep of galactic history. But it was also exactly what the Pren had hoped for when they left their teaching crystals scattered across space. Understanding. Connection. Growth point one student at a time. One lesson at a time, point one page at a time. Starting always with page 6.